right, welcome to today's Explainer. The American presidency is honestly this fascinating mathematical anomaly. Because of the relatively short-term nature of the job, historically, we're talking an average of around 5.2 years per president, the United States turns over its head of state way faster than a country with, say, a lifelong monarch or a dictator. It basically creates this massive revolving door of power, and that fast-paced cycle brings up one of the most interesting historical quests: trying to figure out who exactly has met the highest number of commanders-in-chief in American history.
So, who actually met the most U.S. presidents? It's kind of the ultimate trivia question. Now, to be clear on our parameters for this explainer, we're defining meeting a president as coming face-to-face with them at some point during their life, whether that's past, present, or future. So just standing in a crowd at a funeral, that doesn't count. Because we've had such a relatively high number of leaders in a short amount of time, this creates a completely unique statistical opportunity for the ultimate political insiders. Now, just look at the sheer scale of the winner compared to some massive historical heavyweights. If we look at presidents themselves, well, John Quincy Adams holds a crown there, having met an estimated 14 or 15 other presidents. And if we look at international monarchs, Queen Elizabeth II met 13 U.S. presidents over her nearly century-long life. But they are both totally eclipsed by one extraordinary woman, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who met an astounding 16 American presidents. And today, we're going to explore exactly how she pulled that off.
So the absolutely crucial point here is understanding the mechanics behind Alice Longworth's record 16 meetings. If your life goal is to meet as many presidents as humanly possible, there is a major structural cheat code you have to use. Do not get elected president yourself. Why? Well, because you obviously can't meet yourself. While John Quincy Adams maxed out the presidential networking potential from the inside, Alice was unbound by the Oval Office, and that allowed her to literally maximize her encounters from the outside looking in.
Enter Alice Roosevelt Longworth. She was the eldest daughter of the 26th President, Theodore Roosevelt. But being a first daughter was really just the beginning of her story. The real key to Alice's record is her incredible longevity. She lived to be 96 years old, combined with the fact that she was essentially the ultimate permanent Washington insider. She was meeting presidents left and right throughout literally every single chapter of her life.
As we look back at her life, there are historically two distinct ways people tend to view Alice. Was she this lighthearted, brilliantly witty jokester who provided hilarious, completely unfiltered observations of our nation's leaders? Or was she, well, more of a rude, entitled Nepo baby who just never quite outgrew a teenage rebellious phase? We're going to look at exactly what she said and let you decide for yourself. But one thing is for sure, she was absolutely fascinating and she did not mince words. She witnessed a sheer, unprecedented scale of American history firsthand. I mean, she started making her presidential connections way back in the late 1800s with Benjamin Harrison, remained deeply connected right through the mid-1900s during the era of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and was literally still securing White House invitations all the way into the 1970s with Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. She wasn't just alive for these eras, she was in the room where it happened. Moving into her early era, from gnomes to porpoises. During her youth, her father, Theodore Roosevelt, was rapidly gaining prominence on the national political stage, and this essentially gave young Alice a front-row ticket to the late 19th century political establishment. Her earliest encounters brought out some of her most famously biting reviews. Take her assessment of President Benjamin Harrison, for example. She didn't recount his policies or his statesmanship. Nope. Instead, she described him as a gnarled, bearded gnome of a man. It perfectly sets the tone for the rapid-fire comedic contrast she would bring to the usually highly dignified office of the presidency. And she was equally ruthless with William McKinley, the very man her father served under as vice president. Despite that close political tie, Alice recounted McKinley as a man who had as much spine as a chocolate eclair. It's incredibly fast-paced, vivid, and it completely strips away the usual reverence we give to historical figures.
But, it wasn't always purely negative. She actually had nicer, though admittedly still a little bit backhanded, words for her father's successor, William Howard Taft. She called him a great big pink porpoise of a man who had a smile like a big saucepan of warm milk. What's fascinating here is that she was genuinely fond of Taft. In fact, she even used her sharp political instincts to advise her father against trying to strip the Republican nomination away from Taft back in 1912. Then we hit the mid-century, a time of relatives and rivals. By this time, she wasn't just relying on her father's legacy anymore. She married Nicholas Longworth, who would go on to be elected Speaker of the House.
This marriage ensured that Alice remained firmly planted at the absolute epicenter of Washington power and high society. This intense insider access allowed her to form incredibly sharp critiques. For instance, when analyzing President Woodrow Wilson, she zeroed right in on what she perceived as a deep moral hypocrisy. She stated there was a sanctimonious quality about him, which was frightfully annoying. She also harshly criticized him for his behavior toward women, contrasting it heavily with his public piety. And she kept that momentum going right through the Roaring '20s and into the Great Depression. Get this, she actually took her daughter, Paulina, to meet Herbert Hoover the day before his successor was inaugurated. Her summary of the 31st president? Simply, a rather depressed tortoise. It is an incredibly vivid visual that tells you exactly what the mood in that room must have felt like. Now we find a complex, often shaky dynamic with the Roosevelts who dominated the mid-century, Franklin D. Roosevelt. She was first cousins with his wife, Eleanor, whom she actually seemed to admire a great deal. However, her relationship with Franklin was highly fractured. She claimed she liked Franklin more than the rest of the family did, but she was a bitter political opponent. She fundamentally felt that his presidency came between the two of them in a way that was genuinely disloyal to the broader Roosevelt family. This family friction actually culminated in a shocking public statement during the 1940 campaign. She proclaimed she would rather vote for Hitler than vote for Franklin for a third term. Now, we're presenting this neutrally directly from the source material, but it undeniably shows the absolute intensity of her political rebellion and her willingness to use extreme rhetoric against her own family members in the public square. It's a quote that certainly shapes how modern historians judge her character today.
Now let's look at the modern era presidents. You might think her influence would start to wane as she got older, but no, her sharp observations continued seamlessly into her later years, introducing her to the whole post-war era of commanders-in-chief. Even at Dwight Eisenhower's inaugural ball in 1953, she wasn't easily impressed. She was highly skeptical of Ike's intellect and his speaking style, noting that there were no sparks there and that you could literally watch him trying to find the right words and arranging them in his head like Scrabble. And this brings us right into the 1960s and 70s, when we see a surprisingly varied set of relationships. She had a real fascination with the Kennedy family, giving exceptionally high praise to JFK. She described him as irresistible, a lusty young man, and a really likable creature. She also maintained a camaraderie with Jackie Kennedy. She was similarly fond of Lyndon B. Johnson, dubbing him an engaging rogue elephant of a man. And interestingly, she knew the Nixon family for decades. And when the whole Watergate scandal broke, she held a surprisingly sympathetic view of Nixon compared to the vast majority of the country at the time. So, what is the ultimate legacy of an insider like this? Let's tally up those final historical meetings that cemented her unbelievable record. Her final confirmed presidential meeting was with Gerald Ford, making him number 16. In fact, her status was so legendary at this point that she was even photographed alongside Queen Elizabeth II and President Ford. It's just this striking image of two of the most prolific presidential meeters in world history standing right there in the same room. But you know, the record almost ticked up one more notch. She had a near miss for a 17th meeting. While she was in her mid-90s, she received an invitation to the White House from Jimmy Carter. But Alice Roosevelt Longworth, ever the fierce personality, simply decided not to attend. Why? Because she believed Carter had somehow disrespected her, and so she just declined the invitation, leaving her tally just one shy of 17. So the crucial point we take away from this explainer today is this final astounding number, 16. Alice Roosevelt Longworth met 16 United States presidents. And the most incredible part of this statistic, she met every single one of them while they were actively serving in office. It is a level of sustained, direct access to executive power that is completely unmatched in American history. Which leaves us with this final thought for today's explainer. Looking at her descriptions, from chocolate eclairs to Scrabble boards, we really have to ask ourselves, does unprecedented access give us the truest picture of history, or just the most entertaining one? Alice Roosevelt Longworth gives us presidents not as stiff monuments in a textbook, but as flawed, quirky, real human beings. It completely changes how we view these historical figures. I highly encourage you to dig deeper into her life and quotes. It's just a fascinating lens through which to view American history. Thanks for diving into this with me, and keep exploring.